All right, everyone. So for our narrative argument, what I want you to do is I want you to write a 3-page double-spaced paper that is reflecting back on something that's happened in your life that you feel has taught you something, okay? And one of the ways, like we don't have to write a thesis statement for this paper, but one of the ways that I tend to kind of have students think about what your argument or your thesis would be for this paper is to say, from this experience, I learned blank, right? So what is it that you learned from this? So we're going to have peer review on September 17th. It's going to be due on September 21st. And don't forget, you can always ask for a week extension if you realize you need a little extra time. It's a short paper, but sometimes it takes a really long time just to kind of come up with an idea for this one. And so when we meet for the conferences next week, that's going to be what I ask you is what are you going to write about for the narrative argument? And so if you have if you're like, I don't know, I'm thinking about a couple of different things, let me know what you're thinking. Like maybe say, well, I'm thinking about maybe this or this. And I can give you some feedback about what I think could be a good direction. Okay, so I have some sample essays on here too. If you have any kinds of hesitation, you're like, I don't really know what a narrative argument is supposed to be. These are all supposed to be sort of examples that will help you see how other people have done this in the real world. Here's the little thing about the narrative argument genre, and we're going to talk more about this, is that narrative arguments are actually considered the most persuasive type of argument that we have in the real world. We tend to think of things like statistics and things like that as being the most persuasive thing, and they are very persuasive, but basically nothing is more persuasive than somebody that you know, trust, or think is cool saying, oh, here's what happened to me, and this is what I learned from it. Or, hey, I started using this product and it's great. You should buy it. That is like the most persuasive type of argument we have. They're also really common. And so a lot of times when we think about narrative argument, we think, oh, such a traditional English essay genre, which is true. But narrative arguments are also the ways that we tend to make arguments about things like getting a raise at work. I'll say, hey, boss, I love working here. I just wanted to bring up, that event that I ran last month. I worked really hard on it. I got a lot of really positive feedback. I'd love to keep doing that kind of work, but I think I'm going to need to be, I'm going to need to be compensated, right? So that's the kind of ways that we tend to make these arguments. And so it's really important to get practice with it, and especially with building evidence in this kind of way, because sometimes we think of narrative as, we have this kind of artsy feel to it. We're like, oh, here's all this like beautiful description of a field or whatever. But the truth is that when we're making this kind of an argument, you really want to make sure that the details that you're including will build up to your conclusion being strong, right? So like if I say I should get a raise at work because I'm so good at running these types of events and they really need me for that, I need to make sure that I'm like building up evidence that supports that conclusion, right? I wouldn't want to bring up that one time that I really messed up running an event. That's going to hurt my argument, right? And so that's what I want you to be thinking about is something that, you could maybe make an argument about. You could think about the kinds of themes that are important in your life. It's most important for me to spend time with family. It's most important for me to take care of my responsibilities, things like that. Or you can think about experiences that you've had that really stand out in your mind. And it's okay if you don't even know what the argument would be yet, like what you've learned. This could be a great opportunity to reflect on like, why does this memory stand out to me so strongly? Okay, so I want you again to write a personal essay to persuade someone to think or behave in a new way based on some experience that you've had in life. Some kinds of steps to take here. I want you to choose an event that's specific to your experience if possible. So one of the things, I'm a fiction writer, one of the things that you learn really early on if you write fiction is that actually the more common an experience is, the harder it is to write about. So things like weddings, births, deaths, um, a first date, learning to ride a bike. These kinds of things are like such kind of common experiences. Like their stories are told so often that when we're talking about our own experience, even if it is, something that we actually did experience, we tend to use more like cliches and these kinds of ways that the story's been told over and over, and it's harder to make it stand out. That being said, a lot of us do have unique experiences related to learning to ride a bike or getting married or whatever. And so you can always share those experiences. I just want you to also think about the other kinds of things that we don't typically think of as worth writing about. Like, for example, when you started learning to play soccer, or when you and your best friend got in a huge fight and decided you shouldn't be friends anymore. These are the kinds of things that aren't typically talked about, like as huge life events, but they might have had a major impact on you, right? And I'm basing these on previous student essays, right? So you can also write about things that are really mundane. One of my favorite student essays it was probably like 10 years ago, and I still remember it, was about a student who wrote about walking to class and how they noticed everybody was, on their phone walking to class, and they were worried about people bumping into them, and they really exaggerated it for like comic effect. So it was like a very funny story. But it was literally just about walking to class. And so you can probably find, depending on the way that you think about the world and your experiences, you might go more serious, you might go more sentimental, you might go more funny. Like it's really up to you what kind of story you want to tell. The main thing to keep in mind, though, is that once you have a story, you want to think about what did you learn from that experience, okay? So the last thing, well, I guess two last things to think about. I want you to make sure that you're using a lot of description. I know that we sometimes have an aversion to using description because we think about like these really flowery novels that we had to read, and there's just like so much description, and you're like, oh my gosh, please get to the plot. With something like this, though, you'd be surprised. Like we tend to not give enough description. So I would tell you probably lean into description. And when you're thinking about description, make sure you're especially describing people, because the more familiar we are with things, the less likely we are to describe it because it just seems so clear to us in our minds. So when you are talking about people, especially people really familiar to you, make sure that you're describing them so that the reader can kind of picture them, imagine them. The key to a good narrative argument is that you're making something that people can imagine. And so then when they're reading your story, they're imagining it. And then when they get to the end, when you're kind of talking about the lesson that you learned, they're like, I get it. I see how you got there. And so you don't want them to get lost or like not really follow the story very well. And then whenever you come up with the argument, they're like, I guess I could see where you say, but how you came up with that. You want them to kind of feel like they got there with you, right? And the best way to do that is to help them imagine it using detail. Okay, if you have any questions about formatting in MLA, I am going to be grading on MLA. It's not worth a ton of points on this paper, but I do include a sample MLA essay here, and we will talk about it more before the assignments due. And then the last thing is that I include a rubric at the end of all of our major projects. And so if you want to look at the rubric, you can get a sense of how I'm going to be grading this. For example, the things that are going to be worth the most points, it's always going to be content in the class. And so description and argument, it's a descriptive argument, right? A narrative argument. So those are going to be the two things that are worth the most points, 6 points altogether. And so if you want to look at the longer description in here, it's going to give you kind of like my full description of exactly what I'm looking for when I'm grading. And then I'll leave you little comments in here to help you know kind of like what I think you could work on. Because remember, you can always revise and resubmit any of your essays. So if you're like, oh, I don't know if it's good enough to submit, please submit it anyway. That's the whole point of the class, is for me to give you that kind of feedback. All right, I think that's everything. Please let me know if you have any questions. I can't wait to read these papers. This is one of my favorite genres. So have a great day.